Hello, everyone, and welcome to Loop and Learn's open mic series. And today we get a chance to hear all about Loop Caregiver by Bill Gestrich. I hope I pronounced that right, who is the developer of Caregiver or Loop Caregiver. As we normally do, we talk about our disclaimer. I'm going to ask you to read along as I speak it out loud. A loop is a do-it-yourself closed loop algorithm to help automate insulin delivery. Loop Caregiver is a companion app to Loop and facilitates the remote functions of Loop 3. Both Loop and Loop Caregiver are experimental and not approved by the FDA or other regulatory authorities. This presentation is provided to assist you in making your own decisions in consultation with your healthcare professionals regarding your own self-management or the management of someone you are taking care of. You take full responsibility for building and running the system, and you do so at your own risk. A little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphone on mute during the presentation. If you have questions, feel free to put them in chat, and we're monitoring the chat. But we'll otherwise hold questions till the end of the presentation. And if there's anything I haven't said, just let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to turn this over to Bill right now.
All right, you all should be able to see the agenda here, I hope. All right, you all should be able to see the agenda here, I hope. Let me know if not. But so today I wanted to give you all a walkthrough of Caregiver. I'm going to give a little bit of a demo and show you what the different features are, hopefully show you some tips and tricks you didn't know if you're an experienced user with it. Then we're going to move on to some other details and some security issues to consider. And then finally, we'll go into the Q&A. So I hope to leave plenty of time for questions here. I will try to watch the clock. But if you have a burning question and it's something you don't want to ask right away, I think you could just post it in the chat maybe, and I could stop for that. Otherwise, we'll just wait till the end. Okay, so about myself. So my connection with type 1 diabetes is my mom, and that's me and my mom, pictures maybe 8 years old. But we were, she has type 1 diabetes, and she was diagnosed as an adult, and I think it was maybe 2005. And we were struggling to find a solution that works for us. And it wasn't until 2020 that we discovered Loop. I think the way it came about is I'm a software developer, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could develop some type of app that could connect with her pump? And man, when I did a Google search and I saw the stuff that came up, I was like, okay, never mind. Like, I had no idea what was involved in all of this, and the community had done so much work. I was just blown away. So I still wanted to get involved in some way, and being remote to my mom, she lives just down the street from me. I thought doing remote things might be a good fit. So I got involved with the Loop 3.0 work, where we added remote bolus and remote carbs through Night Scout. And then early this year, I think it was, I got involved with the Caregiver app, which we'll talk about today. So today, my goal is just to knowledge share. This may be helpful if you already use Loop, or this can, give you some information to decide if you want to use it. Caregiver, that is. And just echoing what was said earlier, I'm making no claims for, the safety of Loop or Loop Caregiver. All of this is at your own risk. I think everyone here understands that by now. But so we'll jump in. So what is Loop Caregiver? Like Loop, it's an open source iOS application. It's an application you build yourself from source code, and we'll talk about the options to do that later. But it allows you to see treatment information for, the one you're caring for. So that may be, the last glucose, active carbohydrates, active insulin. We got several different graphs here. These are things that you could actually do in a lot of other apps. You could do in Night Scout as well. So a question is like, what makes Caregiver different? I think it's mainly the command functionality. You can send boluses, you could send carbs, you could adjust overrides remotely, which a lot of people I think have found useful for, their children when they're at school, or if they're at a sleepover, whatever it may be. Night Scout itself, since the Loop 3 integration of remote commands, Night Scout can actually do these things. The difference between, though, just using Night Scout interface and Caregiver is that with the Night Scout interface, you need to use a 6-digit code that you have to get from another application. So anytime you want to enter a bolus, for instance, you got to grab a code from another application, put it into the Night Scout interface. Caregiver actually manages that all for you under the covers. It's not only a caregiver app, but it's like a password generation app at the same time, kind of a custom one that we use third-party libraries for. But it just makes it easier, I think, to deliver those remote commands. And I should mention with my mom, who I think earlier I said she's on the call with us today. I don't use caregiver in the way that the parents here do. She takes care of her own boluses and carbs and things like that. But I use it just to kind of monitor things like you would, for a family member. And I've added these things because I think that I've heard that they're useful for parents as well. So now we'll jump to the demo. Let me share my simulator here. Just be a sec. And I think I'll be able to walk you all through exactly how things work here. We're going to switch to the simulator. All right. Someone give me a thumbs up if you see my simulator there. Okay, great. Thank you. So this is a simulator, but it's working the same as Caregiver would. It's just easier to use for the demo here. We'll first talk about the home screen a bit, which you're looking at right now. On the upper left-hand corner, you have the familiar glucose score that you would, or current last glucose that you would see, in other apps as well. And it shows the time of the last glucose. So in this case, 8:03 p.m. and the change. So, 16-point change since the one prior to that. It's important to note caregiver updates every 30 seconds. So it's trying to keep as up to date as possible, but it has to make that check on a timer every 30 seconds. So if you just delivered a bolus or carbs, wait just a little bit, and then you should see an update whenever the information's available in Night Scout. A little bit of a trick, if you're trying to see refresh things quicker, if you just go to another app or say go to the home screen like I did there, and then come back to Loop Caregiver, you're going to see the spinner. It's going to do an update every time you go into Caregiver. It's just to make sure you have the freshest data as soon as you return. Also on the home screen here on the upper right, you can switch to another looper. So if you have multiple family members that happen to have type 1, you can switch between them. So up top here, I have my one test account. You can switch to the others as well. And it's just kind of a quick way to bounce between them. So talk about the charts just a little bit. The charts here, some of them probably look pretty familiar, and there's a reason they're lifted right from Loop. So one of the key components of Caregiver is it shares some of the same code libraries that Loop uses. So that allows Caregiver to have this similar user interface in a lot of cases. So you get some things for free, like if you tap and hold on this upper graph, it's going to show, or this chart, it's going to show you what the glucose score was. That's just functionality that was taken straight from Loop. There are some differences too, though, and some limitations. If you try tapping on this graph, it's not going to take you anywhere. With Loop, if you tap on the graphs, you're going to get more information. Not everything's the same. Not everything's implemented that you would find in Loop. Just some of the basics were brought in. Looking down a little further, with respect to the graphs, you see there's an active insulin row, and there's like nothing underneath it. The idea is I wanted to bring in all of the Loop graphs, but I didn't get to them. So you'll just see the active insulin. There's no chart underneath it. It's just I haven't gotten to that yet. The idea is someday they would all be here. Like the active carbohydrates is another place we're missing a graph. There's questions about how do we fit all of these, what's the most important ones to show to a caregiver? We haven't gotten to all of that. So I've kind of punted on those decisions. And that's why it kind of looks the way it does at the moment. The graph at the bottom, the timeline here, this is one that's particular to Caregiver as compared to Loop. I was aiming for a Night Scout-like interface. So you notice some of the icons, they sort of loosely match what you'll find in Night Scout, some of the coloring and such. The idea is I want to make sure that if you already use Night Scout remotely, which I did, you kind of had a familiar experience. And I think a lot of people kind of appreciated that view. So I started with that. And then later on, we brought in the loop graphs. That's why there's a difference between that one and the bottom and the other ones. This one was like one of the first parts of Caregiver before the additions there. So the Night Scout like interface, this timeline, you can scroll backwards up to 24 hours in the past currently. Someday we may increase that to a couple days. There's some issues like with caching where we need to do some performance optimizations before that would work. But right now you could go back a day. And it displays your glucose, carbohydrates, boluses. You can zoom in on this graph. You'll notice like it's really tight in some places and it's kind of hard to figure out what's going on. So recently I added this selector here, kind of mimicking what you would find on the Night Scout website. So you could change the scale to just be an hour. And, it kind of stretches the graph, makes it wider so that you can see more. So it separates things. Trick on the zoom here, if you double tap anywhere on this graph, it's going to toggle between the 6-hour view and the 1-hour view. So I just double tap on one of these and it's going to switch back and forth there. It's a nice way to kind of zoom in really quickly and then pop back out to what I think would be the view where people sort of default to. I'm not really sure, but that's one shortcut there. Also, a recent update that was made here is you can tap near any bolus or carb item, and you're going to get more information about that. You're going to get a view that's a little easier to view when there's a lot of clutter. So for instance, if we tap on this 125 gram carb entry, we're going to get this view here. This is going to show, near where I tapped, what were the things around that. And one of the problems with iOS when you're dealing with a graph that's this small, it's kind of ambiguous what you're touching on, especially when a bolus and a carb entry are like right on top of each other. So I show things within a couple minutes, not just the thing you specifically tapped on, because I'm not quite sure what it is that you intended to tap on. Additionally, coming soon is you'll be able to see the errors that occur when somebody attempts to send, say remote carbs, for instance, and there's an error within Loop, say the password expired. We're going to talk about that in a bit. That's going to show up here as well. So for the first time, you'll be able to view errors that occur on the Loop side within Loop Caregiver. That's been a gap that's been, and we've had in functionality for a while. I'm going to show a screenshot with some more information on that. But right now, in order to make that work, you either have to have Loop Dev, so you have to be using the Loop Dev branch, or wait until the next Loop version is released. So whenever that happens, whenever we update Loop with the changes in Dev, you'll see that functionality. So moving on, we'll talk about the carb entries here. So I'm going to tap on the carb icon on the lower left here, the little meal icon. This is probably a pretty familiar view, similar-ish to Loop. You can enter the number of carbs that you had consumed. You can select a time. This respects the same time limits, or it should anyways, that Loop enforces, where I think it's 12 hours in the past maybe, and it might be an hour in the future. I might not have that exactly right, but it's going to respect those same limits. You can select a food type, and this feature was actually introduced by someone, I'm not sure if they're on right now, but just his first name is Augie. He added this, which was pretty cool. Took this from Loop and adopted the same paradigm. You could switch the absorption time there. You could also edit the field, just with your keyboard as well. So after you fill out the form, you go to submit a carb entry. There's often a little confusion about how bolusing interacts with this. And I'm going to get to that more, some techniques and some safety issues around that you want to be aware of. But one thing conceptually to note, when you input carbs on the carb screen here, it's similar to going into Loop and inputting the carbs and not accepting the recommended bolus that goes with it. So if, I'm going to enter, let's say I was going to enter 10 carbs here, this would be the same as going into Loop inputting 10 carbs, and for the bolus, selecting 0. What's going on is caregiver does not have the loop algorithm. It doesn't understand all of your settings. It doesn't understand your predicted, how these carbs are going to impact your prediction. It can't suggest an appropriate bolus from here. It just doesn't have that capability. So it's always going to just choose 0 for the bolus amount. Now, after those carbs are sent to Loop is going to do its thing. And by that, the algorithm may increase your temp basal, or maybe you'll get, a series of auto boluses over time. That's just Loop operating as normal, but just conceptually think of it as a carb entry with a 0 unit bolus included with it. So that is the carb screen. We'll talk about the bolus screen. This is probably the simplest view within Caregiver. You could just enter your bolus in units. And this and the carb screen is going to respect the settings that you have, the limitations for boluses and carbs. So if you say for your child, you want to limit them in your Loop settings to, say, a 5-unit bolus, you could come in here in Caregiver and you could try to give them a 10-unit bolus and you could send it. Loop is going to reject it though. And it's going to say, you're going to get an error in Loop that says, hey, your settings only allow 5. And in the future, when the next version of Loop comes out, you're going to see that error in Loop Caregiver. It's going to say that you've exceeded the maximum bolus. But all of those limitations should be respected from Caregiver. And it's actually, I won't get into it, but we limit you to 10-unit bolus in Caregiver. Like if you try to do 11 units, you're going to get an error. But the true enforcement actually happens on the Loop side. That's where it's respecting your Looper's settings. Now, I will mention bolus recommendations because you may have seen these before in Loop and in Night Scout. So when you are in Loop and you input, say, 50 carbs and you don't deliver any type of bolus, often later on, you're going to see a recommendation that says Loop recommends a bolus of so many units. And then, you can choose to accept that within Loop. For a long time, this isn't a new thing. That information gets uploaded to Night Scout. And you may have noticed when you're in Night Scout, it'll show that there's a Loop bolus recommendation. That's different from Caregiver recommending a bolus. Caregiver still does not have the ability to recommend a bolus for the carbs you're about to enter. But when Loop makes a recommendation and it uploads that to Night Scout, Caregiver is going to show that. But just a careful distinction, that's for carbs you've already that have already gone into Loop. It's not a new carb entry where Caregiver's making a recommendation. So a little confusion about that, but I will add to that. You want to be careful about accepting the recommended bolus remotely from both Night Scout and within Caregiver. Because let's say, for instance, that Loop is recommending a 5-unit bolus. That's going to get uploaded to Night Scout, that recommendation. And then let's say you see it in Caregiver and you say, all right, I'll do the 5-unit bolus. Well, what if at the same time Loop was providing an automatic bolus and it gave a couple units of insulin at the same time? You got to be careful and just know that in a way you could be competing with what Loop is doing at the same time if you decide to enter that recommended bolus. So just be cautious about that and aware that could happen. So, and we'll get more into techniques for entering carbs and boluses in a few moments when we get back to the slides. So the final view I plan to show here is the override view. So that's the little, I call it the heart icon at the bottom. But when you tap on that, that's going to highlight the override that's currently active. In this case, I didn't have any active, so it just goes to none. But you can just change that to whatever you want. For various reasons, I have a bazillion override settings here for testing and such. But you tap the update button at the bottom and that'll update it. If you want to cancel an override, the user interface here is a little weird in this respect. You scroll up and you hit the none, you select none, and then you hit update, and then that'll cancel your current override if you want to cancel. You can switch between them though without using none. So if you were at 10%, this one here, and then you wanted to switch to another one, you could just go straight to it without having to use the none between that. None is only used to cancel completely. If you want no override, you have to use that. I think that's kind of it for the walkthrough. We'll jump back to the slides here. And 1 second as I adjust my share. All right. So, okay, should be back on the demo slide. So we'll move forward here to talking about a particular carb. I'll call it the carb plus bolus risk that you can get yourself into trouble with. Once you understand it, I think it'll make sense here. And this was actually a recommendation from different parents and people testing, ways to work around these issues. So I'll explain it by example. Let's say that your child is going to have lunch, and they're going to eat, say, 20 carbs, and you want to deliver a 1-unit bolus to cover those 20 carbs. Potentially the wrong way to do it, and this is where I have the X in the presentation, this flow. You go into Caregiver, you input 20 grams of carbs, Caregiver sends that to Loop. Loop logs the fact that you have input 20 grams. If you have auto bolus active as your in your settings, maybe it's going to deliver what it thinks is the proper insulin amount for that. So shortly after, it's going to deliver, say, about half a unit of auto bolus. In the meantime, you're remote. You put your 20 grams of carbs. Maybe you don't know about that auto bolus. I talked about the 30-second update cycle. Well, it could be even longer than 30 seconds. Maybe there's a network error. It's just the time between, the information going from Loop to Night Scout and Night Scout back to Loop. It could take longer than that. So you don't know that an auto bolus of almost half a unit has gone in. You go into the bolus screen and you enter that 1 unit that you plan to enter. Well, at this point, your child has received 1 unit and almost, 0.4 of a unit, 1.4. That was not what you intended. So they were over bolused in a sense, and then you would have to respond to that. So I think the most important thing is to understand that flow, that could happen, to kind of guide your decisions. So here is what has been suggested by different folks in the community to kind of avoid that. Input the bolus first and then the carbs. So in this instance, we would give a 1 unit bolus with Caregiver, and then that'll be received by Loop. Loop will log, Loop will know about that unit of active insulin that's on board, then go into Caregiver and enter your 20 grams of carbs. Loop receives the 20 grams and it says, I already have a unit, because the Caregiver already delivered a unit. I have that. So it has that knowledge, and they'll say, I'm not going to give an auto bolus, potentially, because I already have a unit on board. So in that case, you would deliver what you intended. So flipping the order of operations there can make a difference. I didn't mention throughout all this means you're going to have to calculate or estimate these bolus amounts. So when you're trying to input carbs, you don't have the benefit of having Loop to tell you how many units you need to deliver. In the future, we could potentially figure something out like that. We don't have any capabilities, so you'd have to find a way to estimate that. And I'm sure there's plenty of tools and such. So it's going to be less precise than you are when you're working directly within Loop. But this is, I think, a reasonable workaround for now. How am I on time? I think we're still good. So another risk to highlight is kind of similar to the last, but it's a little different. The duplicate entry risk, I'm referring to it. So by example, again, let's say you want to input a 1 unit bolus. So you go into Caregiver, you input a unit, Loop delivers that unit. But let's say there's a delay in Loop notifying you that it was a successful delivery. Right now, this is going to change, but right now there is no difference in Night Scout between a failed delivery and a slow notification that a bolus has occurred. They kind of look the same. You just don't see anything. So if you are waiting for that that bolus to arrive and you don't see it, and you very quickly go and deliver the unit again, you may have just delivered 2 units inadvertently and kind of doubled, the bolus that you intended. So it's just important to note, failed commands are not reported yet. They will be soon, but you're not getting failed command information yet. So just use caution when you retry. And I don't have like a rule of thumb, like wait this many minutes or, wait 15 minutes, 5 minutes. I don't have a rule, just because if there's an error, I mean, it could be anything. It could take an hour. You just got to use your judgment, and do what's safe based on what you see. And I think with practice, as you kind of watch, the process of entering commands when your child is in a certain location, you will have a better idea of when it's safe to retry. Just a note, even after we're reporting failed commands, there still is a risk here, because we could fail to upload the fact that the command failed. Like the command could fail and the network could be down, and then we can fail to notify you of that. So you still need to be careful. You'll never have 100%, ground truth on what happened until you get something that tells you what happened, like a failed command or a successful bolus. So now we'll move on to remote error reporting. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I did want to show what the UI is going to look like here. So Night Scout is going to show failed remote commands. So when you deliver a command and it fails, you're going to see information like you do on the left-hand side in Night Scout. So it's going to have in the timeline there, I think that's what you call it in Night Scout, it has that little gray circle. I think that's the same circle that you see if you change your pod, if you have an Omni pod, I believe, or maybe if you suspend your pod or something, it's going to look like that. When you tap on that, you're going to see these additional details. So if you're a remote caregiver and you use, Caregiver, you're going to see these new gray little dots. Just tap onto them to see what they are. That's going to come in the next Loop version, available in Loop Dev now. This does not require any type of Night Scout update. You can use your existing version that you're already using with Caregiver. We kind of hacked an existing feature, that's the note feature, to support this error information. Later on, I'd like to find a better way to do this, but this was kind of an interim solution to give you this info before we get further along in remote 2 capabilities. Now, on the right-hand side, this is how it'll be reflected in Caregiver. So the timeline view is going to show the bolus. So in this case here, let's assume I tried to input a 10-unit bolus. It failed. It's going to show in red the amount, like you see there, and it's going to strike through it. It's going to run a line through it, and that means there was a problem with it. If you tap on it, you're then going to see that view that I showed you earlier that shows details regarding the timeline. And like here, it says exceeds maximum allowed bolus and settings. So I think this will be useful when the next version of Loop is released. So moving on, browser builds. So I'll just mention up front, I am not the expert with the browser builds. I've used them, but the credit for this integration here will go to the other Bill, William Booth, who added support for this in Caregiver. But I did want to make you all aware of it because I think it's such a important feature for building. So no Xcode is required. You build from your browser. It's similar in a process to what you do in Loop. There's actually, Marion made some really awesome documentation. I think others probably contributed it to as well, but she, it's really good. So I say it's a very, it's not a difficult process, but it's a detailed process. So you really need to follow all of the steps. And if you have problems, let someone know. But it's really great. So moving on to Xcode builds. So of course you can build without using browser builds. You can use Xcode directly as well. That may be if you want to customize Loop Caregiver. So if you want to get into the code and make any kind of modifications, if you are interested, you can do that as well. There is a script that's available in the Loop docs that will help you perform the local builds as well. So it's really nice for cloning the build and getting started. Just a little more here. So let me see what kind of time we have. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do this slide. Yeah, I think we're good. So I want to give just a tiny bit of conceptual information about how remote commands work. And I hope that this will help you when you run into errors and even some security concerns. You can put those into context and perhaps be a little more secure with this knowledge. I promise not to get too technical though. But on the left-hand side, this is just when you're setting up a remote caregiver, when you go through the setup process, it's going to ask you to scan a QR code or a QR image from Loop. That gets stored to Loop Caregiver. Note that that QR image, think of it like a password, or it's a secret between Loop and Loop Caregiver. Nothing else should have that. So Night Scout doesn't even know about this password. This is only between the two apps. They store them locally. They don't share them. They don't send them across the internet or anything like that. Because it's a password, be very careful about where you share this. Never put it on social media. If anyone asks you for your QR image, don't give it. There should never be a reason to give someone your QR code here, unless you want them to be able to remote bolus your child, if it's a family member or something. But there's no reason really anyone else should have that. So guard it with your life. And but the reason that's useful, this QR image, is from the QR image, we have an algorithm in the app from some third-party code where it can generate a 6-digit, it's a number, every 30 seconds. From that QR image, we can generate a 6-digit number every 30 seconds. That is what gets sent over the internet. So whenever caregiver sends a remote bolus command, so on the right-hand side, Loop Caregiver is going to send a 2-unit bolus command. It's going to send that to Night Scout. It's going to calculate what the 6-digit code is from its copy of the QR code. It's going to send that to Night Scout. Then Night Scout's going to send that to Loop. And then Loop, because it has the QR image, is going to say, hey, does the code that was sent to me, does it match my code that I calculate from the QR image? If it does, it'll let it go through. Otherwise, it will reject it. So, that's kind of the connection between the QR image. I think the number one thing is just the security. You don't want ever to, lose that QR, or I should say, share that with someone you don't trust. Some have suggested, and I think it's a good idea, to have that QR image local to yourself, meaning like, what if you lose your phone, or what if you need to delete and reinstall Caregiver and your child's at camp or something like that? It's just nice to have it at home. So maybe print it out. If you're comfortable storing it without iCloud or something, you can do that. Just find a secure place to keep it that you can get back to it if you need to rebuild. One other thing to mention on these codes, Loop is only going to accept the last 2 codes. So the current code and the one just before. And that's just to make sure that we only deliver commands that are the most recent, because we don't want to deliver things change very quickly with Loop. Auto boluses are delivered and such. So commands, they're like stale, like, they lose their context, they're old. We don't want to deliver them. They're not relevant after a certain period. So they expire quickly. So that brings me to just some tips I'll mention regarding expired commands. So on the bottom, you see the expired message. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. There's a couple different reasons this can happen. So this is iOS delays the delivery of push notifications for many different reasons. Just because you may have your child in the same room as you, and you send a caregiver command, you may see it pop up on the home screen of your iPhone right away. There's still sometimes a delay in when iOS tells Loop that it had been received. It's a strange thing, but sometimes there's a couple minutes between them notifying us. So that's just kind of a variation. Sometimes it's just late to come all together and you don't see the push notification for 5 minutes. But some things you could do to try to avoid that. One, definitely, if you have focus modes enabled on your child's device, make sure that Loop is added as an app that can push through that. So you're basically telling iOS, hey, when we're in focus mode, still allow Loop notifications. So that's in your iOS settings. I have found that Wi-Fi works better than cellular. So if you have the choice to use a Wi-Fi network, often they tend to push through. I think it's because iOS may be trying to help with, if you have a data plan, it's trying to avoid maybe using up too much of your data. That's just a theory. Another thing you could do, if you notice that you're suddenly getting a bunch of expired commands, like they're all coming in late, try rebooting your child's phone. And by the way, all these tips I'm referring to, this is referring to your child's phone, not the caregiver phone. There's really not anything you can do on a caregiver phone to help with expired notifications. But on your child's phone, you could try rebooting it. That seems to reset things. I believe there may be a quota that the operating system is using that says, once I get this many push notifications, no more, and it just kind of stops. So that seems to reset it. The battery, a low battery, can cause push notifications to be delayed or not come through. If you're in low power mode on your iPhone, that can cause similar issues. And then finally, this is also just a theory, turn off other notifications, like other apps that are really noisy, like game apps. If you're having a lot of issues, try turning those notifications off. It's possible that if iOS just sees a lot of notifications coming in general, that it might suppress them for all apps. I don't have data to support that because this is all a black box, but that is something to experiment with if you can't resolve it doing these other things. So some of the future initiatives here, and I'm wrapping up here, is the remote command to error stuff. That'll be reported in Caregiver. I talked about that. That's in Loop Dev right now. Time-sensitive notification. So you can mark a notification as a developer. You can mark a notification as time-sensitive, and that helps it to push through some of those issues I mentioned earlier regarding late commands and commands just not, or push notifications not coming through. We weren't marking our remote notifications as time-sensitive, unfortunately. So what that means is they weren't getting that priority that we would have had liked them to have had. So a change was merged to Night Scout maybe a couple of months ago to mark them as time sensitive. So whenever the next Night Scout release comes in, I'm crossing my fingers, hopeful that that's going to make notifications come in sooner. So those changes are in Night Scout Dev. If you're familiar with deploying alternate Night Scout branches, you can do that. But for most, I just recommend waiting for the next Night Scout release. Remote 2.0, that's in progress. You may have heard about that. That's a related thread here I've been working on that will help make all this remote stuff more secure, work more reliably. And I've already started integrating changes in for that, and one of them being the remote command error work. But there's so much more to do to really make this better. I'll communicate that information as that's available. And that brings me to the final slide here. Zulip is a great place to follow. I put announcements as I make changes in there and as there's caregiver updates. So I definitely recommend following that if you use caregiver. The Loop docs, of course, that's that includes just about everything you need to know for getting started. A lot of troubleshooting information there that's going to be really, really valuable. And in fact, Marion just pulled in my old notes from I can't remember if I mentioned this, from the Google document. That's in Loop Docs now. So everything's in the same place right now, which should be nice, or it will be soon.
I think we can leave it right here and leave that screen up for a little bit.
Okay.
We'll need to take quick notes, but you have a bunch of questions in the chat if you're ready to take them.
I'm ready to go. Yeah.
Alrighty. Why is the meal carbs icon using the Loop app pre-meal preset icon?
That may just be an oversight. So I guess you're saying that we may have the wrong icon. I'm actually looking at Loop right now. That's right. We found a bug. So whoever found that, thank you.
Thank you, John.
I will need to update that. It's probably been like that since the beginning, maybe, which is pretty funny, but that was not intentional. So yeah, no, thank you. I will change that. So.
All right. So there's a question. Does this QR code change like every so many minutes?
No. And that's a good question. The QR code will stay the same. You can go into Loop, and if you go into Night Scout settings, and you tap on the QR code. It'll show like the password. You tap on that, and it'll show the QR code. There's a refresh button. You can manually change it. So if for security reasons you want to update the QR code, or let's say that it's compromised, you emailed it, and you don't want it in your email or something like that, you can go and refresh it. You'll just need to rescan, delete the looper from Caregiver and rescan the new QR code. But it should stay the same over time. They should not change.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that if you do that, every single person using Loop Caregiver has to do it. So if you have more than one provider, they need to be told that the reset happened.
That's a great point. Yeah, it gets more complicated when you have more people using Caregiver, for sure.
Okay, and then there was, I guess these are questions for the end, so we're close to the end. Unless you have more questions, please put them in the chat, or you can even unmute and ask a question directly. But will you add favorite foods?
Favorite foods, that I believe that's a feature that's coming. Is that right? That's not something that's been released
Yeah,
yet?
it's in dev, but Pete's already talking about what are the blockers, and let's get ready for 3.4. So
Yeah.
it's going to be in 3.4. And I have to say, personally, I do all my carb entries using favorite foods. Now, I'm not taking care of anyone, but I don't know if there's other people out there who really like that feature. So
I tell you, I would love to. Yeah, I would love to do that. So I think that certainly should be on the backlog. It seems like that's a no-brainer in terms of something that people would use. So I think we should pursue that. So I don't know when, but probably those types of things, like simple things, like and that's probably definitely not a simple feature. I tend to try to pull those in, like and it prioritize those. The things that take longer, they kind of get put behind the remote 2.0 like stability stuff. But I think someday we will be there. So.
Okay, interesting question. Do you have plans to add alarms or alerts to make Loop Caregiver more of a follower app? And a note, Loop Caregiver can be used on a Mac. Very nice. It's an Apple Silicon Mac.
Yeah, that's right. You can use Caregiver on a Mac, which is pretty cool. I mean, that's what I was doing here via the simulator. But yeah, I guess you can also build it as an app itself. I haven't used it in that way, but I believe you can. In terms of the alarms and stuff, that's very interesting. I never intended for Caregiver to like be a replacement to Loop Follow or anything like that. I know Loop Follow is amazing, like all the different things you can do with it. But I think at some point it would make sense to do more of those types of things in Caregiver. But I don't know exactly what it would look like or how it would work. But I can definitely see the value in it. So that's another one. I think yes, someday we should do that. And if there's anyone, I should say, interested in the community that would like to do some iOS development, I can get you started and show you we don't have to do all these things serially and wait on me to complete Loop 2.0. We could do things in parallel, is what I'm trying to say. So, but I think that would be a great feature. And Mary, I'm Joanne, I'm done at this point in terms of slides, so we could just take more questions.
Okay. Alrighty. 2 more questions. Could we make a switch from dark mode to light mode in the app?
Possibly. I guess so. You can do that with iOS already. So I'm curious what the motivation would be. Maybe it's because you're using like dark mode for the rest of your. There we go. I'm using light more for all my email. Okay, so maybe some variations in what you want to use in different apps. Potentially, I guess I have a question. Does Loop do that? Does anyone know? Do they have the option to switch? Oh, you're on. I'm not sure if you're talking, Marian. You're on mute.
Hit the space bar. We can hear you then.
Yeah, I'm looking on my app, but I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is, okay. It is an
No.
interesting feature to consider for sure. Yeah, so I think that's something to potentially look into at some point. But no plans at it for the moment. But it's good to know that someone is could benefit from it.
According to John, no, you can't. I assume that's his answer to
Okay.
whether you can switch it from dark to light.
Yeah.
Okay. Also again from Brian, I also had a challenge getting the looper first enabled and added. I didn't realize I needed all 4 of those fields. Could you put a star on them so we know they are required fields?
Yeah, I guess it's not giving good enough feedback to say what you're missing is probably what I imagine. Like we at least need an error to say, hey, you're missing this field. So yeah, that's I'll take that into consideration here if I could get around to improving that view for sure. Yeah, we don't want to trip people up when they're getting started. So
Okay, and from Beck, I like the plate to enter carbs as it moves straight to time we use 1 hour for fruit. I am using this wrong per first question. Don't know if there's a question in this. If there is, just let us know. If there's anything else, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll wind this down and let everyone either get dinner if they're on the West Coast or go to bed if they're on the East Coast or wherever you are. I have up on the screen the information for donations to the Night Scout Foundation, which supports developers. We're asked very often, how do I give back in the community? And that's certainly one way. You can always volunteer your time, your effort, whatever people need. Ask Carol, how can I help you? And she will put you to work. But also there's the Night Scout Foundation. You'll see this on the video on the replay. The video will be up and posted on our YouTube channel. And thank you everyone for looping with us and joining us. Yeah.
Interrupt for a second. Before everybody leaves, I just want to remind people that we have a few events coming up. One would be a special Australian version of our open mic series. That's happening on Wednesday. You can check out our Facebook group to get the exact times and your location. And we also have a Loop open mic on a US friendly time and a European friendly time that is going to be on the 21st. It's a Thursday. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll stay informed of all of our great upcoming events.
It's an amazing newsletter. It goes out weekly. It is important information that you might not get otherwise in your busy lives. So definitely sign up. If you don't want to read it that week, you don't have to, but at least it's there for you. And the information has at least been received in your inbox. It's a great thing to have. On the screen are just some ways to reach us, some ways to learn a little bit more. If you have more questions, just pop up questions on the Facebook group. You can reach Bill, tag him, and thank you everyone. Hope you had a great weekend, and thank you all so much. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you to Bill's mom for sharing.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Good night.
thank you. Yep. Bye-bye.